Hello, this is Suzanne Fiorino again. I'd like to welcome all of you on the call today to the first MDICx webinar on the case for quality. I'm a Senior Director at Johnson & Johnson's Medical Device Organization, but currently function as the MDIC Case for Quality Program Manager. And we're here today to provide an overview of what is the case for quality. We'd like to share with you today some of the background on the case for quality, what has happened in the past, how MDIC got involved with the program, and then what are the plans for the future from our various working groups that we have established. Since we are virtual today, just a couple notes. We will be taking questions, but through the Q&A panel on the WebEx. So if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and send the questions in, and we'll answer them toward the end of the session, as many as time permits. I'd like to just turn to a little bit of introduction on some of our presenters today, some of our panelists. Since we are virtual, we thought we would share some pictures of folks. And first up on the left, as you see, is Dr. Stephen Solomon, who is the Deputy Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs at FDA. You'll hear from him and Joseph Sapiente, Vice President of Global Quality Operations for Medtronic, along with several of our working group leads. We'll hear about the maturity models work that Deloitte performed for MDIC from George Serafin, who is the National Managing Director of Deloitte Life Sciences and Healthcare Regulatory. Pat Baird, who is Director of Engineering from Baxter Healthcare, will talk about the Competencies Working Group. Kristen McNamara, who is the Senior Advisor for Global Operations, Office of Global Regulatory Operations and Policy, FDA, will take us through some work on the Measures program. And last but not least, we'll hear from Garth Conrad, Vice President, Quality Spine and Biologics, Medtronic, on some early concept work on analytics, which has been an interesting area of discussion for the working groups. Before we move into the main part of the program, I would like to just give a brief highlight of MDIC, or the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. MDIC is a public-private partnership whose purpose is to collaborate on regulatory science to make patient access to new medical devices technologies faster, safer, and more cost-efficient. MDIC was founded in 2012 and is one of the few, if not only, public-private partnerships solely devoted to the medtech space. We currently have 49 members and are actively working on 5 projects, one of which is the Case for Quality program. MDIC works collaboratively with representatives from industry, regulatory bodies, and other nonprofits, including patients, providers, and academics, to advance the programs. So before we turn the program over to our speakers, we wanted to share with you a brief video on what is the Case for Quality. There's a lot of pieces and parts to it, but we thought this could sum up what is that program.
Nearly every part of the patient experience is touched by the use of medical technology, from wheelchairs to artificial joints, state-of-the-art imaging and genetic sequencing to tongue pressors and stethoscopes. What if we could enhance the safety of these medical devices, drive up innovation and safety, and drive down costs? We can, and
So certainly you can see with the number of lives that we touch in the medical device industry, the highest quality medical devices are really an important priority. I'd like to turn the program now over to Joe Sapiente for some brief welcoming comments, and then he will turn it over to Dr. Solomon. Joe? Okay. All right, it seems like we've lost Joe for a minute. Dr. Solomon, are you on?
I am.
Okay, let's go ahead then. We'll start with you.
Okay, so from Joe and I'll add my welcome to this virtual webinar for the MDIC Stakeholder Forum. As Suzanne said, today we're really trying to focus on the case quality and a very exciting project. Just a minute more on MDIC because I think this provides a great venue and a great opportunity to bring a lot of stakeholders together. So within this MDIC Case for Quality Forum, there's government, FDA, academia, industry, buyers, and very much appreciate that a large number of people volunteer their time to serve on these projects and work groups with the ultimate goal of raising the overall level of quality in medical devices. I'll go into this in more detail in a few minutes. FDA has been working internally over this for the past couple of years for an initiative that we call Case for Quality, and I'll talk more about that. But in order for this to be successful, this is not strictly an FDA initiative. In order to meet our goal of raising the overall level of quality medical products, it needs to be a collaborative approach. Industry, government, academia, buyers, investors, we all have a shared interest and a shared responsibility to invest the time and energy in developing new practices, new work projects that will positively impact medical device quality. So it's a complex process. You'll get a flavor for what's going on today. But this webinar is very important to us to inform a broader audience about our efforts. So we're going to tell you a little bit more about Case for Quality, and we're looking to get positive contributions of questions today and thoughts and ideas about how we improve quality. So very much appreciate folks taking time out of their busy schedules to be part of this webinar. So thanks, Suzanne.
Great, thanks, Steve. Joe, are you on? Yep.
Can you hear me?
Okay, and yes, we can.
Oh, I'm sorry. I lost the internet connection, but I'm still on the phone, so I'm trying to get back on the internet connection here.
Okay. So, Joe, just a couple welcoming remarks from your perspective as industry lead for the steering committee.
Certainly. Again, thank you, everyone. I was actually welcoming everyone when Suzanne, I could hear you, but apparently you guys couldn't hear me. But I do want to first thank Suzanne for helping pull this together, and certainly this is something that is no easy task. We did a group forum face-to-face, and this is our first MDIC webinar forum, so I'd like to thank Suzanne for her efforts. And also welcome everyone to this webinar. As Steve mentioned, this is not just an FDA, this is not just an industry, this is a partnership of industry peers, stakeholders. MDIC has helped facilitate the forum, bringing all of us together to talk about the case for quality and what it means. And I think, when you see, we have a fairly full agenda today. We've got a lot of things to cover, but I think as we start talking about what is the case for quality, the journey that we've been on, I think it'll provide a bit more clarity around some of the projects that you'll be hearing about later on in the discussion. So I, again, want to thank everyone, and also want to thank Steve Solomon for his ongoing support, as well as our industry peers and the key stakeholders that we've been working with on this program.
Great,
Suzanne?
thank you, Joe. And now over to Steve to talk about the FDA's case for quality priorities and activities.
Great, thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Joe. So just a little bit of history here, sort of how we got here, that eventually resulted in this webinar today. So FDA, particularly our Center for Devices and Radiological Health, has spent a lot of time back in 2011 looking at the issues of quality in medical devices, particularly looking at our inspection results and recalls, and saw virtually a lot of continued observations during inspections, device quality system reg inspections, that the types of problems we've seen to see remain steady over the years. And we continue to see a very static level of volatile inspections. And so it caused us to start thinking about what was our inspectional work helping us to improve the overall quality of medical devices. And so we worked with McKinsey, a consulting group, to engage and analyze device quality issues. And if you folks have not had a chance to read that report, I would encourage you. I think it's on the FDA website. It's a 2011 report, Understanding Barriers to Medical Device Quality. And it lays out a lot of the data, the interviews, the surveys that were done with the industry, and makes a case and some recommendations that we're now seeing come to fruition. And so FDA subsequently made a plan to help address those, and we call that the case for quality, and that name has moved forward. So the next slide, this is intended, as we've now described a couple times, to drive through kind of the barriers described in that report so that we can collectively improve medical device quality. We did, and as mentioned, we're working in partnership with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and industry to try and move this is not simply a regulatory piece, even though FDA is involved and we're continuing to do our regulatory compliance activities, but our premise here is we want to move beyond the baseline of regulatory compliance and try and encourage a sustained state of enhanced medical device quality. And so part of the key point in getting that done is we recognize the people I mentioned earlier, all the stakeholders. We need to have that continuous engagement process with the stakeholders. And so that's what's important about both having the MDIC forum to have a regular engagement, and then the outreach with these webinars, which is the first one we're doing, to try and engage more people on it. So to talk a little bit about the timeline on the next slide. So as mentioned now, we sort of launched this in 2011. We did lots of work within FDA in 2012 and 2013, both internally and externally. We went to lots of different meetings of the device industry throughout the country. We worked lots with regulatory affairs professionals. We worked with quality professionals in the industry to try and gain information and feedback, talk about some of the proposals, talk about the paper, Understanding Barriers to Medical Device Quality, and to talk about elements like what's critical for quality. In 2014, we moved this process forward, and we did a number of follow-ups. We helped start create the MDIC Forum on case for quality. One of the issues is being more transparent with data that the agency has, and we released a lot of data under our application programming interface, or API. And then, once again, we're continuing our efforts in the case for quality. There's both an FDA internal group, and then also Jan Welch from CDRH and I serve on the MDIC steering committee. So we're both doing internal efforts. What you're going to hear after me, for the most part, is going to be the efforts that MDIC is working on in collaboration with all the stakeholders. So the next slide is the list of dashboard. This is representative of the dashboard that we're using within FDA of our priority projects. So we've done some projects related to critical to quality projects. We worked particularly with some gaining information about the critical to quality elements for implantable device batteries. We provided some inspectional guidance. We had some volunteer firms that we went into, and to evaluate by focusing the inspection on critical to quality elements, how did that change the inspectional process? So we're still evaluating that, but we did look at critical quality as how do we determine what's the most critical elements and how do we get that information out. You'll hear a little bit more later on device quality measures. That project started within FDA, and now we're doing a handoff in the MDIC, so you'll hear some more about that. We partnered with other folks, the American Society for Quality, to try and better develop both training available to focus on quality issues and try and make it more specific for the device industry, and also a library of quality practices that industry's been putting together so that everyone has the advantages of having, the best training and the best thinking and best practices. We'll have a description a little bit more, but we've been thinking about maturity models and their value. So the project that you're going to hear about in a few minutes that under the MDIC was one that FDA was very interested to explore of the value of maturity models. Additional areas that we focused on, we've done some surveys on device purchasing needs assessment. We worked with purchasers, the hospitals to understand the cost, value, and quality needs in the market. We surveyed MedSun, group purchasing organizations, and the American Hospital Association. And then, as I mentioned before, we've got a number of projects to post on the web, relevant case for quality information. And we continue to assess what information we have that can be valuable. And we're finding lots of people are now looking at that information and thinking about how to better utilize that information to improve quality in the device industry. And the last piece relates to the pre-market application reviews. It's another critical to quality project. The goal there is to identify the key characteristics specific to various medical devices and to identify the impact of those characteristics failures during the review of PMAs, and then working with firms to identify those controls. So once again, those projects are kind of, some are completed, some are in their formative stages, but they're work that we're doing. And just to sort of show you on the next slide who is, this is across the FDA organization. So the Center for Device and Radiological Health, the Office of Compliance and CDRH, my office, the Office of Regulatory Operations. We also have folks working with us from our global regulatory operations and policy. We have folks both from headquarters staff, national experts, and our district offices and staff. So it's a broad group of people that internally to FDA that we're using. And we just recognize that in order for this to be successful, there's got to be broad input into it. So just wanted to share a little bit of the history of what FDA's done, the history, how we got here, and let me turn it back over to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And along with the work that FDA was performing along the way, there was also some work on case for quality that the Advamed team has been performing. So wanted to turn it over to Joe Sapiente to explain a little bit about that work that is a great work in progress.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Steve. Suzanne, do you want to advance slides, or do you want me to take the ball?
We'll advance.
Okay. So everyone, as you saw in Steve Solomon's presentation, you saw something that was talked about the successful practices, and I'll spend some time in taking you through that. But before I get to that, I wanted to just let you know that when the peer companies first were involved in the case for quality, we were working with our FDA partners and some folks, external consultants, and we started talking about the case for quality, and we started talking about setting some goals. And one of the things that we as a group decided, we needed to get a common set of goals. And what you see here is the work that that peer group did and then took to Advamed. And one of the things that we felt in the early days of talking about the case for quality was that we felt that this was something that Advamed could get behind and would sponsor, and they quickly got behind it, and we launched our Case for Quality Steering Committee. So as the steering committee got together, we looked at these goals, and you can tell quite clearly that we were looking to improve product safety and quality at a lower total quality cost. And there were a number of ways that the group felt we could achieve that. And again, in line with what FDA and the peer groups were looking for was a shift from the quality, from compliance to quality. And how do we evolve some of those regulatory models to promote device quality? A number of our peer companies and leaders felt that most of the purposes of the inspections were more compliance-driven than quality-driven. And we talked a lot about the risk-benefit framework and how do we create preventive models so that we could start to drive quality into design very early in the process and take benefit from that, as well as identify the safety and the risk-benefit within the early design process. Wanted to talk, we agreed that we needed to have measures of quality and early indicators, again, working towards a more preventive model. You'll hear a little bit more from Pat Baird on improving education and awareness within the industry, and this is something, again, very early on was identified as one of our goals. And how do we communicate the case for quality? And we talked a lot about getting to forums, and certainly this is one example of our ability. And this was not just an Advamed framework, but it was certainly everyone that was involved in the case for quality very early was making sure, how do we communicate to all of the stakeholders what the case for quality was and what it meant. And then finally, identification and validation of those quality practices. The reason that's important is because we all came together with a common, with different common interest, but a different way of achieving it. And so when you look at our second slide, we had to make sure that we understood and had a definition of what was quality. And we worked a long time to get to this definition. And we felt that as a group that the definition for quality resonated well with everybody within our peer group, our stakeholders and partners. And we actually were able to come to a common definition and then share this with with the FDA and get buy-in from them that we could agree on what this quality definition was. And you'll see that we felt it was very important to include the safety and effectiveness and usability of our products, as well as that element of customer satisfaction, making sure that we were able to meet user requirements. And I could tell you there's a lot of discussion around uniformity, reliability, and performance. And again, the group worked really hard to get to this point, and I think we're all very happy with where we ended up. So as we talked about the definition of quality, we then started talking about those common practices or those successful practices in terms of how, next slide. This is a different slide from the one I had, Suzanne.
Yep. So why don't we just stay on this slide, Joe?
Okay. So as we started talking about the library of successful practices, if you want to give me the, I guess it's the same presentation, never mind. So in terms of the library of successful quality practices within medical devices, the approach that we took at the Advamed committee was, taking a look at all of the member companies and the successful practices that they've employed. And before I get too far ahead of myself, we wanted to then pick some of the drivers. And I think Steve mentioned some of the common causes of what was causing recalls. And design was one of the top, if not the lead category in terms of common causes for recalls. We all agreed as a group that we couldn't take on all of design control, so we wanted to take on specific aspects of design control, and we started looking at the use of critical to quality characteristics. So using that as our guiding principle, we decided that we wanted to bring member companies together to share their successful practices that they've employed and how they implement critical to quality features. Looking at the selection of practices, we ended up with a number of submissions, and the team, the sub-council that was formed, spent a long time going through each of those practices, creating what we then called was the chapter or the book that we were going to put into our library. So when we talked with the group, we ended up coming up with the introduction of the library, and imagine books in the library, books on the bookshelf in the library, and design control being one of the books, and CTQs being one of the chapters within that book. And what we were able to achieve was being able to collect over that period of time. It took about 6 or 8 months to get all of the material collected, excuse me, and we were able to bring in about 11 different groups, 11 different peer companies that were able to share their critical to quality characteristics, their process, some quantifiable and measurable examples that were essential to the device's quality, and were certainly within our medical device quality definition for quality. So when you think about the library of successful CTQ practices, again, which is that chapter or that book that's on the shelf, we have design control CTQs, successful practices. It represents the first entry into our library. We're currently working on production and process control, and there's a meeting this week actually to refine some of the content, and that'll be our next book on the shelf. As I mentioned, we had 11 companies that provided input into our library, and if you could imagine within each of the books, you've got these chapters. So there are 11 distinct chapters. They're based on company size and category. And what you'll see is you won't know what the companies are, but you will see how the different approaches that companies take in implementing CTQs within their design control process. And there are a number of tools, as you can imagine. So again, as we look to identify the characteristics of CTQs, we anticipate that they would result in higher quality products, which meets the overall arching goal that we were looking for in terms of improving quality, lower cost, and also what we felt within the design control space, we could have impact actually the speed to market or the time to market that you would see in terms of the commercialization process. We have the website is alive right now, and it has the CTQ library, so I hope some of you, or if not most of you, have already had an opportunity to access the website and take a look at the content that's in there. And as I mentioned, the purchasing control content will be available later this summer. And like we've done in previous Advamed meetings, we'll continue to provide everyone an update on the next chapter. In fact, we've got a meeting coming up later this week to start talking about what are the next upcoming chapters, do some calibration around the common causes, making sure that we're completely aligned with our stakeholders and peer groups to make sure that we're going after the right chapters for the next book. So again, as we kind of look back at the original goals that we had set for ourselves to improve product safety and quality at lower total quality cost, again, I want to remind you that we're looking to shift the focus from quality to quality from compliance, evolve those regulatory models, and promote device quality, achieve a preventive model with agreed risk-benefit framework, improve our ability to measure quality and early indicators. Again, how can we become more preventive and predictive? Improve education and awareness within the industry. There are a number of things that, as we start talking later on about maturity models and measures, the competencies that some of our folks will need in terms of improved education and awareness, and how that works, and how do we work across the various stakeholder groups that we've identified. Clarity around communication of the case for quality. We continue to communicate through these forums, not just this forum, but some of the other working groups. You'll hear more and more. I think we hear an awful lot now, which is a very good thing about the case for quality. And I think what's most important is the partnerships that you see that have formed over the years between us and industry, payers, providers, those key stakeholders, regulators. And it really is a definite partnership when you start looking at some of the other work that's being done in the industry or in this case for quality initiative. And then, as I mentioned, the validation of those quality practices and taking it beyond design control, looking at purchasing controls, looking at CAPA and software and things like that, and how can we develop advanced materials within the library. And then the next step is how do we keep it fresh? So periodic review of that content and making sure that the content is meaningful and the material is available for a broad audience. So I think we've got a couple of minutes now. So Suzanne, we can pass it over to the next presenter.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joe. And thanks both, Joe, to you and Steve, and just setting the history around the beginnings of the Case for Quality and all the great work that has happened to date. What I'd like to do briefly now is to share a little bit about how MDIC became involved with the Case for Quality, talk a little bit about our timeline for the year, and as well as our working group structure. So as you heard from Steve Solomon, MDIC applied for and received a Broad Agency Agreement, or BAA, grant from the FDA, and the purpose of that grant was to fund the activities associated with the MDIC Case for Quality program. All aspects of this are to work toward improved medical device product quality. So there are various deliverables that we're working on, but that's the overall goal and framework, and certainly build on the work that has been done within the FDA and within other organizations. There are 4 primary deliverables associated with the program. The first was to conduct some research on quality maturity models, and you'll hear very shortly from George Serafin about the work that Deloitte performed for us. The second was to create a venue for quality engagement forums, and you'll see that as we talk about the schedule on the next page. The third was to create a list of topics to be used to generate discussion, interaction, and action during those sessions. And as we get into the working group presentations, you'll understand what is being done by each of the working groups that have been assembled to date. And finally, as we will go into a little bit later in 2016, we have a requirement to develop a change action plan summarizing the results of the work that will have been done in 2015 and 2016. So from a 2015 perspective, there's really 4 aspects of the program that we've been working on. The first was around our steering committee, represented by the top line and the green stars that you may see on the schedule. We've assembled a steering committee currently representative of members of industry and FDA. We've been meeting on a twice-a-month basis, and a lot of our early work was really around planning the program in order for it to launch and execute on some of our commitments. One of those commitments was to establish a diverse group of stakeholders to gather together on a consistent basis in forums. We have established that, and we held our first forum meeting in March of this year. We have about 50 members that are participating. They represent not only industry, but the FDA, customers, and other stakeholders and associations. We also have a commitment to run or operate a couple of large or what we're calling open forums, the first of which is on our call today, or MDICx webinar. And we have plans for another open forum later this year, October 8th, out in San Diego, California. And certainly the core of our work will be the work that will be done by our working groups. The steering committee met recently and approved the start of 3 working groups and 1 group that will be a set of early development work. So that's a little bit about our schedule for this year. Let's take a look now at how we're organized from a governance perspective. So as I had said earlier, I have the role of program manager for this program, but from a steering committee perspective, we have a MDIC board champion assigned to this program. As Steve Solomon mentioned earlier, we have both himself and Jan Welch, Acting Director, CDRH, on the steering committee. And we have several individuals from industry whose names you see on the slide that are participating as steering committee members. Both Garth Conrad from Medtronic and Cisco Vicente from the FDA have been very involved in the Case for Quality program, so they remain on as technical advisory role in the steering committee process. As I said earlier, the Quality Forum brings together industry representatives, the FDA, customers, other stakeholders and associations. And one of the benefits of bringing all these groups together is it's allowing us to get some diverse perspective, and we certainly welcome and encourage that. As a result of our first couple of meetings, we have established, as you see below, 3 working groups. You'll hear from George Serafin on the Quality Maturity Models Working Group, then Pat Baird on the Competencies Working Group. Marla Phillips, who will chair this, is not available, but we'll hear from Krista McNamara, who is our FDA lead on the Measures Project. And then finally, we'll hear from Garth Conrad, who is working in the analytics area on what we're calling early development work. So that's from a governance perspective, how we are organized. And with that, I'd like to turn the program now over to George Serafin, who will take us through the quality maturity model, both research and working groups. George?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So as Suzanne talked about, as well as Steve and Joe, we were very excited to have the opportunity to support the quality maturity model research and had just recently completed that research, and I have a few minutes now to be able to share the process as well as the output, conclusions and recommendations from that effort. So to give you a bit of background, we were asked again, as said, to go and look at maturity models, but these maturity models were not intended to be within the life sciences industry, recognizing that there really wasn't one that was really established. Many people use in the life sciences industry some type of maturity model to perform assessments within their own respective companies and organizations, but really the interest was looking outside of life sciences and seeing if there were any maturity models that were well established and had success in implementations, and how that potentially could be adapted to medical device industry. So looking at a couple of key activities that we did as part of this overall project, we certainly were leveraging a lot of industry knowledge, both internally within Deloitte as well as across multiple industry sectors, and understanding the functions of the maturity models and how they've been implemented. We conducted a very significant literature research effort to identify these maturity models that had been published and established within select industry sectors that I'll go into a minute. Once we did that, we then went into issuing benchmarking questionnaires, gathered further information and detailed analysis about a select number of maturity models. And then finally, we also wanted to be able to leverage a lot of our federal knowledge and being able to communicate directly with other federal regulators aside from FDA and understanding their visibility, potential use, and interactions with industry through the use of maturity models. So just to go over the approach here on this slide, we first went over and conducted our maturity model research and identified a number of models. As you can see there along the bottom, you can see how they come across the various sectors. A number of them were cross-industry that were being adopted, but we also looked into the energy sector. We looked into finance, transportation, which also included aerospace and defense, as well as automotive and electronics. Once we had gone through those models, we identified 22 in total that we wanted to perform more literature research on and provide an analysis to the steering committee that then could be reviewed and then down-selected to a select few that we would want to further evaluate. That further evaluation would be the benchmarking survey that I had talked about, as well as a series of interviews with industry subject matter experts and the various regulators within those respective industries, and then ultimately issuing the final report. As Suzanne indicated, we had just completed this work. You can see on the right-hand side in the research criteria in terms of the industries and scope, some of the sources that we had from our literature research. And then from an identification, a couple of key criteria we were looking for was how long the model had been established. Was it really widely accepted across an organization, or was it just in a particular area, say in IT versus purchasing versus risk management? How well it and what were the success stories around the implementation in a particular industry? And also how complex was it? Because certainly we wanted to make sure it was adaptable to the medical technology industry. Next slide, please. So then we went through a fit analysis. As I said, we identified 22 in total, and then down selected to the 5 that you see over on the right-hand side. And we basically characterize each of the 22 models as either being a very good fit, which you would characterize a couple of elements that you see there I just highlight. We certainly were looking for more of a holistic fit, being across people, process, and technology. A culture of quality was incredibly important. And we needed to make sure there were models that actually had the ability to assess the culture of quality and the people component from a quality perspective, in addition to process as well as the technologies that are enabling the process. We certainly were looking for how easy it was to update with regulatory change and applicability to the device industry, and you can see several others there that are listed. Agility, I think, with size of business was also very important. We wanted to make sure that this was a model that across industry could be used in any demographic and any size company. So whether it's a very well-established medical device company of great size and geography to startups that are also trying to begin to benchmark themselves as they continue to grow. You can see then the characterization between a good fit and a weaker fit in terms of how well it's established, how many of the components it's really defining, and how well it could be readily applied to the device industry. So out of that process, we came up with the 5 that were on the right-hand side, and we used this 5 then to create a industry survey that we went out to a variety of customers and organizations across these various industry sectors, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So here you can see here we reached out to 210 companies across the select industries that we talked about. In connecting with each of those, we recognized that a significant number of them actually had not used maturity models to any great extent, had been talked about quite a bit. There was interest in doing it, but they really had not actually moved forward in that capacity. In terms of the folks that did do that, we certainly gained a significant amount of information about those, which I'll share in the next couple of slides. We also wanted to utilize public forums, so there were a lot of different maturity model discussion boards that we interacted with. We also looked through networking sites such as LinkedIn and connected with various folks and professionals, and we also leveraged various industry groups, ASQ and IEEE being 2 of those, and understanding their expertise and experience, folks that had actually implemented the models across the various industry sectors that we had talked about. And then in terms of reaching out and having the survey, we then went and talked to specific subject matter experts and various regulators across the various industry sectors that we identified, really focusing in on understanding, as you can see there, some of the elements that are listed below. Taking the regulatory standpoint view for a second, it was really interacting with regulators and understanding how much they've used these models. Is there visibility in terms of how these models have been applied in the industry? Was there any interest in leveraging these models as a communication vehicle and working with the industry? And we had some very interesting answers and some starts and stops and some lessons learned that I think were very helpful for us to share with the MDIC steering committee. And you can see the distribution across the right-hand side. Again, very nice distribution of companies. Again, size. We wanted to make sure that we were talking to folks of different sizes and geographies to really get a very clear picture of the use of maturity models in those select industry sectors. Next slide. So in determining through the 5 that we started with, CMMI, the Capability Maturity Model Integration, was identified as being the most commonly used model. And we determined that it was the best fit to potentially leverage as part of the medical device community, and we made the recommendation to MDIC, which was later ratified. Specifically to the model, just a couple of pieces that came out of the analysis that I thought I would share with everyone. First is the fact that you have a formal decision analysis process in terms of understanding how the model is applied to a specific organization. So it's very structured, very established, and the ability to then be able to have consistency in how it's applied. Certainly that consistency message is going to come up quite often, as you'd expect. We certainly found that it complemented medical device standards, really focusing on process performance and closed-loop improvement. Certainly the recognition of the model was very important as well. We see that it had success stories and had been used in a variety of different industry sectors, and certainly we saw the applicability to the medical device industry as well. We also like the fact that CMMI had been used to prioritize what to focus on. As we know, we can't boil the ocean. We have to eat the elephant one bite at a time. And so it was important to hear that this model had been successfully implemented where it could be used to prioritize where organizations wanted to focus their efforts to be able to move the needle with respect to maturity and how it could directly impact quality. Quality is being defined as product quality or service quality. Excuse me, and as you heard from Joe, really was moving beyond compliance. So this, again, the models, the adoption of the models, as well as what Steve said, is really to move from just focusing on compliance, really trying to move the needle with respect to product quality. Standardization, very important, and the ability to leverage that standardization to increase efficiency and consistency. And lastly, the people element of that in fostering a culture of quality, we also recognize the CMMI what did identify and did as part of a holistic framework, did incorporate the people and culture aspects with respect to quality and improvement. So our recommendation to the MDIC and FDA was to leverage the CMM model that will warrant further consideration for the development of a quality maturity model for the medical device industry. In addition to the specifics that I talked about the model before, in this slide I'm really recognizing here a couple of key elements here as you'd expect in terms of why to support that recommendation. You know, the global recognition, we are currently right now talking nationally and with FDA and the medtech industry, but having a model that is recognized globally is also equally important in the ability to communicate with regulators. So certainly it fit that. Being well established, starting out as a capability maturity model and then growing into the capability maturity model integration as it's called now. So it's been established for well over 20 years. Having a CMMI Institute, we've met with them several times. So we have an independent authority and the ability for them to be able to provide governance and maintenance around the maturity models and process frameworks. Being well-defined and holistic across people, process, and technology, as I mentioned before, and the flexibility that was really needed in the industry to make sure that it would be applicable to all sizes of medical device companies, and also the ease to update with regulatory changes. As you see below there, you'll see that there's actually 3 different process frameworks or constellations, as they're called in CMMI speak, that we also recommended that should be used for the medical device industry. There's one that is more focused on product development, there's one more focused on procurement, and one on services, and we think to provide a much more holistic coverage of the medical device value chain, that all 3 of these process frameworks should be looked at collectively to develop the one and to be adapted for the medical device industry. So one question everyone is probably having when we started is, well, what's the benefit of maturity model? Why is MDIC, FDA, and industry interested in this in the first place? So wanted to take a minute here and highlight a couple of different areas of the potential value that a quality system maturity model can have to everyone in the medical device industry. I've mentioned already a number of times the consistency, the ability to compare apples to apples, not only within an organization, but across the entire industry, company to company. So it would provide a very, very strong vehicle for effective communication and the ability to benchmark against each other, as well as being able to see where noticeable improvement is having from a quality perspective. You heard from Steve and Joe and others talking about beyond compliance. So this is really not focused, it's not a compliance process framework, it's a quality system maturity model. So it's really focused on moving the needle with respect to quality. The ability to streamline communications and interactions with agencies, especially FDA, being able to sing from the same sheet of music, being able to talk about the process capabilities, you heard that also earlier in the presentation, talking about the capabilities of an organization with respect to quality, and the metrics and measures associated with that, those critical quality elements that were mentioned as well. So this is an opportunity to leverage that vehicle. Also, predictability and flexibility. So now everyone using the same model and applying the model in the very same way and having the maturity of each organization being assessed the same way provides a level of consistency and predictability of when you're going to focus on making changes that you can then be able to evaluate those further and see if you're really moving the needle with respect to maturity, but also keeping enough flexibility, again, given the different dimensions and organizational structures size that the industry has. And lastly, again, cultural change. How can you leverage the maturity model to be able to improve cultural change as well as monitor the culture of quality within each respective organization? So we think these are a number of different areas that would be of very potential value with respect to the medical device industry. And then lastly, talking about timelines. So we're currently now in the model development piece. We're aligning with the metrics and measures team. We're beginning to adapt the CMMI model for the medical device industry. And we're also building our strategy for our pilot program, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second. Then we're going into, when we go into Q4, it's really then looking at the metrics that should be applied to a particular process area within the capability maturity model, defining a project plan around the pilots, and making sure we're, again, continue to be aligned and supported with MDIC. The objective here is to actually execute a pilot in the first quarter of 2016. So we would not apply the entire maturity model to a select set of companies, but actually more of just a particular process area, and have that applied to respective organizations and have it evaluated, and then be able to take those lessons learned, refine the program, and then be able to build out additional process areas moving forward. So it's a fairly aggressive plan. The team is very supportive of it. We feel that we have a very strong chance of making it, again, with a lot of focus and a lot of great support across industry and FDA. So very excited to be able to report our progress at a later date. And with that, I'll turn that over to Pat.
Okay, thank you, George. I wanted to talk a little bit about, just in a couple slides, about the Industry Competency Development Project. And one thing that I wanted to point out was that, unlike some of the other projects, this is actually a brand new project. It's a new team that formed less than a month ago or so. And so we're just in the beginning stages of defining what it is that, that we want to do. What we've talked about so far is just, you know, what is the type of problem that we're trying to solve? What do we think needs to be addressed? And as we're walking through things, we came up with a statement that we think that having an inconsistent understanding of what we mean by quality, and by having not having the best clarity in what the other stakeholders' perspectives are, what their constraints are, what their user needs are, is actually driving a lot of inefficiency in product development, in product launch, and regulations, just completely across the medical device industry. And so our mission statement is that we want to improve both device quality and patient safety by putting together a collaborative environment where the regulators, the payers, the providers, et cetera, can work together, better understand each other's needs, better understand their perspectives, and start moving beyond, as this message has been repeated so many times in this presentation, moving beyond baseline compliance and moving toward true quality, really meeting what our stakeholder needs are. We've also started defining, you know, the stakeholders would be the healthcare providers, the payers, the frontline clinicians, as well as the manufacturing industry and the regulators. So what we expect to see as our long-term outcomes. So if we were successful, you know, what kind of improvements would we expect? And so we came up with a list for that of improved safety and efficacy of the products, because they're better at meeting the user needs. Better patient outcomes for actually lower cost, because we're doing exactly what is needed. The products have become more usable. The products are going to get to market faster, because we're going to be better at understanding what everyone in this ecosystem needs. We can reduce our cycle time and reduce the time that it takes to launch a product, because we can focus on the more important things. Inspections are going to be more effective. We're going to have a reduction in findings, and overall reducing costs, because poor quality does have a cost associated with that. And so ultimately the cost of the products is going to go down. and our design and design documentation is going to be better and more maintainable over time. On the next slide, our top-level sort of deliverables would be a competency model of this quality for all the stakeholders. It includes the future state that we expect, an assessment of the current state, and any gaps that we see between future and current. We'll also come up with, high-level recommendations for how we should close these high-priority gaps. These gaps will be prioritized, sort of a high, medium, low ranking, so we know which are the more important ones to work on first. And for the very highest priority things, we wanted to identify some quick wins and give a more detailed suggestion to the steering committee on how we think we should move forward. At that time, we'll come up with a proposal of how we think we should explore and deliver on the remaining items. The detailed steps on the next slide is that we're going to, and this is what we're right in the middle of right now, is defining the stakeholders that are within this competency assessment, and defining the expected competency and skills for each of those roles. So imagine a spreadsheet, imagine a table. You have a list of stakeholders and you have a list of competencies, and just sort of we can start mapping which competencies are the most impactful for which stakeholders. We perform an assessment of what the current state is versus our ideal state. We prioritize those gaps, as I said before, high, medium, and low. We come up with some ideas on how to close the gaps, not a full-blown plan, but at least directional, to say this is how we think that this particular issue could be addressed. And then identify some quick wins, identify some low-hanging fruits. One thing, we haven't made a commitment yet, but one example that we'd come up with on our last call was perhaps improving management reviews that happen inside of design centers. And, what are current issues with it? What are current myths and fallacies of holding a good design review, a good management review? And defining what a good, high-quality, impactful, meaningful management review actually looks like, as well as determining, is this an article, is this a talk, at a trade show, how would we best deliver this particular message, this particular intervention out to the industry? After we identify those low-hanging fruit, we would come up with the recommendations for the next phase. What do we think we should do next? And then return to the steering committee and proceed from there. And from this, I'm going to take and hand it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Pat. And delighted to have a chance to talk today about the Device Product Quality Metrics Project. This was a project that was recently brought under the auspices of MDIC, and so it's just launching in this new forum. And we've had tremendous support from reception from the MDIC Steering Committee and some volunteers from the MDIC Forum. There's a lot of excitement around this project, so I'm delighted to talk about it with you today. As you heard from Steve Solomon, this was a project that initially began under the FDA Case for Quality, and it was a collaborative effort then that FDA, Xavier Health, and representatives from more than 15 firms have collaborated on. And what we started with was the problem statement that, what we had done in the past just wasn't working to achieve optimal product quality, and that we needed to rise above baseline compliance and do something that was going to move product quality into a much higher realm. So one of the things that we have been very aware of is the ongoing effort in the pharmaceutical quality realm that we also have tried to stay abreast of and try to leverage, so that we were learning from their lessons and kind of took things in a different direction based upon some of what we were seeing, trying to kind of stay aligned so that we would be consistent, because recognizing many people have combination products that are pharma and device, but also recognizing there was probably a better way to do this. So we had representatives from 15 firms, and FDA and Xavier Health combined, split up into 3 teams, basically, and we looked at the pre-production, production, and post-production phase across the total product life cycle, and started instead of kind of what pharma had done, just throwing out a bunch of measures, we decided to look first at the critical systems for ensuring device quality and agreeing on what those were. And after much deliberation, we kind of focused in on about 11 critical systems. And then the second phase was to define the kind of best quality practice or good quality practice, you could call them gold and silver as in the Olympics, that are beyond compliance in those critical systems that would ensure product quality. And we came up with 97 of those different possible gold and silver activities. We looked then to industry and did a survey for ways that industry would recommend measuring those best practices or activities, had 208 respondents representing hundreds of years of experience in the device industry, and we're thrilled to receive just reams of pages of ideas. And so using our 3 teams, you can see we came down to taking what in essence was about 124 ideas that we put through a kind of matrix and ranked them and came up with 17 measures that we thought made the top of the list. The matrix that we used to arrive at these 17 measures had criteria that were really important. The first one, obviously, and the heaviest weighted, was patient safety. As you heard Pat and others say, that's one of our heaviest outcomes that we're considering. The second criteria, design robustness. The third, process reliability, followed by the fourth, quality system robustness, and finally the failure cost. So what we did was rank all the ideas, the 124 ideas that we agreed to look at on those criteria, and then kind of sifted through that, and in a face-to-face meeting came up with these 17 top measures, including 2 that were overarching kind of from a corporate level. And what I want to share with you just briefly is that all of the examples that you can see, we just gave you a sampling of each from each of the phases, touch on prevention. And basically a lot of what we discussed was how can we have measures that get a finger or on the pulse of or are monitoring multiple data systems that tell you how your product is doing. So in the pre-production phase, the example we're giving you is, one of the measures folks agreed to focus on was identification of critical to quality elements. So you design the product that you get right first time, you can have sustainable CAPA to prevent any recurrence of any problems and ensure kind of a life cycle approach to critical to quality elements through ongoing monitoring, and some firms even using a heat map to identify trending and setting areas that are going to become problems. In the production phase, the example I'm going to share with you of one of the measures we identified is CAPA sustainability, the percentage of CAPAs with no recurrence. And, again, long-term sustainability to enhance right first time. And in the post-production, the example there is monitoring critical to quality components across the total product life cycle. You monitor and feed them back in, again, to achieve right first time and feed back into that pre-production critical to quality work so that your ongoing monitoring is being input all the time. So if you look at the next slide, we tried to present this also in a kind of diagrammatic way to make the same point. You start with design controls. That's just the box I'm going to choose. And you can see you've got impact from there into technology, knowledge, and transfer that has quality implementation, and then post-market surveillance ultimately. But you can see there are feedback loops, continuous improvement and risk management feedback loops throughout this whole diagram. So the focus is really on enterprise-wide continuous improvement, looping back into R&D so that whatever quality measures we focus on can be, in essence, recycled back through the total product life cycle. So if you look at those 3 boxes, you have what we're going to ask in our ongoing work with MDIC is to have one measure in each box piloted this year and see if, in fact, the measures that we are identifying work. So if you look at the next slide, what we're proposing is that under the MDIC steering group permission going forward, our work group is going to convert the 17 measures. We had a team vote, and we picked the top 3 that we're going to pilot and see if we can validate their use. We want to continue, obviously, to share our findings and get input from this broader stakeholder forum and whether they resonate, whether they adequately represent and stand in for what you would need to evaluate device quality. And if we can pilot them, we're going to first have to agree on how you define them, how you calculate or assess them, the frequency of testing or monitoring, how they're reported, what unintended consequences they might throw up, and how we're going to mitigate those. And as you can hear from the previous descriptions, what George was describing about maturity models, Pat about competencies, and you're going to hear shortly from Garth about the analytics, we think our work is going to be beneficial for the other work groups as well. Our hope is that the outcomes are not just useful for firms, but that payers would benefit. If our work contributed to something like a maturity model where you could see measures that were indicative of quality that would be valuable barometers for you to monitor. So just to walk you through on our final slide, the kind of action steps and timeline, we are meeting later this month to agree that the top three measures, one in each of the phases of production that we voted on, are the ones that we're going to pursue and pilot. We're going to meet later this summer and talk about how to actually convert those into metrics by agreeing on definitions and how to calculate the frequency that we would be doing taking the measure and how it would be reported, and then actually run a pilot from October to March and try to give it a good 6 months or so of testing these measures, and volunteers and firms have offered to do so to see if they work. We're analyzing those results and then presenting the findings back to MDIC. So we look forward to being able to continue to report on our findings to the MDIC Steering Committee and the broader stakeholder forum, and to staying aligned with the other teams. And you're going to hear from Garth next about the analytics team.
Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate it. So what I'm going to talk about now is a project that's just in the formation. MDIC is sort of authorized moving forward with gathering some initial information, looking at the concept of how analytics affects medical device quality, and seeing if there's a scope of a project that we can define that works with the other projects that you just heard about, but sort of advances the overall methodology of using analytics to improve quality. So if you go to the next slide. The concept of what we're looking at is a team, and there has been an initial team that's been pulled together. We've had a couple of discussions regarding how to advance forward. But analytics is a fairly well understood or easy subject matter. Taking product data, taking information, running through some analytics, whatever it may be, graphical techniques or statistical techniques to determine differences. But ultimately, the concept there is to get information out of data and present that information to customers to allow them to make better decisions. And in the case of what we're looking at here, obviously, with the support of the medical device industry, is how do we support customers that are making decisions about use of products to improve patient outcomes? So it's really that link of quality data or product quality data or process quality data that drives improved outcomes in patients in the long run. As the team started to go through this project and understanding what we were going to look at, we took a look at what are the barriers. Why isn't this in place today? It seems pretty easy to run analytics or collect data or just to analyze and understand what's better than another thing that's out there. Well, the challenge that we have is, as Kristen was just talking about, there really have been no standards for how metrics or data is gathered or collected across medical device manufacturers today. So going to one company and examining CAPA processes or CAPA metrics and going to another, it's very difficult to do comparisons back and forth. So the work that metrics and methods or measures team has done so far in establishing some of the common definitions and methodologies for collecting, analyzing data are very important as a supporting effort into this. Because we'll need to take those standards and apply them across a broader set of stakeholders. The other thing that we identified as we were first looking into this is that a lot of times manufacturers are unwilling or unable to provide data, share data. In some cases unwilling because they don't want others to understand what their performance is, or they want to control where the information goes. But the second thing is that in some cases, data is not even being collected associated with the quality of the product. Again, leaning back on the effort that was done by the measures team, very important in understanding what are those things that help identify quality characteristics of our processes and products that help drive improvement in the future. Now, as we get into a little bit more about what this team is going to focus on, there really are no standards that are out there regarding analytics and how quality data or quality information is analyzed and presented out there to provide information to the customer so that the customer understands what quality means, or it's presented in a fashion that allows them to make the decisions that they want to make. So we understand that we're going to have to work around creating some standards for analytics, how it's presented, how it's available, and those types of things. So the team will take that on as part of the project. The last thing that's in here is that some preliminary discussions that we've done is that customers are not necessarily knowledgeable of what analytics is, or what graphs or what statistical analysis presents, and how that information is important or could be important to them. And linked directly into that, this slide, one of the things that we examined as a team is really there's a whole variety of customers that are out there that we deal with on a regular basis. Internal to the manufacturers, obviously we have our own internal customers that we present data or analytics out to, but then external, we have the regulators, the providers, the caregivers, the patients, and the payers. And each of them has a slightly different view on quality. Giuseppe started the discussion today talking about the work that Advamed did in aligning around a definition for quality. And if you take a look at what that definition is, it's very broad because it took in the perspective of each of these customers that you see here. And it's important to understand that that's great. When you're presenting data back or analytics back to one of these customers to help them make decisions, though, the challenge is that it becomes much more focused on what they perceive quality to be and what they want to see in terms of data or information. So after the team examined what the customers or potential customers were, we narrowed in on one customer in particular, which is the provider. And really what we were using used the basis there is that Steve Solomon talked about at the beginning of the presentation, that FDA has done some work with the hospitals and understanding what quality means to them. So we were looking at leveraging the early work that was done during that project and how we move it forward with saying not only what is quality, but how does information get presented from the manufacturers that allow those providers, those hospital systems, to make the best decisions around the devices that they're choosing to use for their patients. So if we go to the next slide. So whether you consider it simple or complicated, here's a view of analytics that I've used quite a bit in explaining sort of what any project around analytics entails. And this is a view from the standpoint of a restaurant. If you think of a typical restaurant, there's ingredients that go in, raw material that go into the kitchen that allows the kitchen to first store those ingredients, you know, refrigerators and freezers and cupboards and all sorts of other things. But after that information or that raw material is stored, it's then pulled out, applied to a recipe, and that recipe cooks it up into some form or fashion using the appliances or the tools that you have to create a meal or create a presentation to a customer. And ultimately with analytics, what you're presenting to the customer is something that allows them to gain information to help them make decisions. So very similar to a restaurant format, if your menu, if what you're presenting to the customer is not what they want, then your analytical solution, the data you're providing, has no value to them, and ultimately you have no customers. So we started off with this model talking about first, as I mentioned before, we analyzed the customers, but focusing in on the customer being the provider, how do we get to a menu of options or data or information to that customer that's going to allow them to make the decisions around quality and how to advance quality for medical devices. So taking all that into account, what we did is even narrowed down a little bit further from the hospital standpoint, and what we looked in particular was the value analysis committees that operate within the hospitals. For those of you that aren't aware of what a value analysis committee is, these are the committees within the hospitals that will evaluate technology and compare technology between different providers to understand which technology, which solution offers the highest quality or the best outcome for the patients. So they're evaluating it across a whole slew of characteristics. What we're focusing in on is obviously we're not concerned about the economics. That's outside of the scope of what this project is working on. But what we're looking at is how do we provide data or information, analytics, that will help the value analysis committees understand what are the highest quality products and which ones can help achieve better outcomes. Now, I'm sure you're thinking in your mind, well, there's a lot of groups that are out there that are looking at comparative analysis of products and looking at clinical outcomes and those types of things. The clinical outcome aspect of it is not the initial focus of what this analytics team is. We know there's a lot of work that's being done in the industry on that, and we decided we want to step a little bit away from that at the present moment. And what we're looking at is those other quality measures. So the things that Kristen brought up, as well as maybe even a broader scale across those measures about how that feeds into these value analysis committees to allow them to make decisions. And that will back us into the rest of this model that you show we have in front of us today. What are the raw materials that we need? So what's the data or the information that we need to create the analytics that then allows them to make the decisions that they need to make as an organization. If you go to the next slide. So I talked about the customer being the value analysis committee. Where our working group or this early concept group is at right now is that we felt before we could move forward and do anything else, we actually needed to go out and get some voice of customer. So we've now established some meetings with a couple of industry experts that work within this value analysis sort of realm to understand what data is used as part of that process, how analytics could assist that, and then furthermore how the manufacturers could provide information in sort of standardized, commonized, or harmonized format that would allow for decisions to be made around the quality of the product and thus the better outcome for the patient. So we're working through those details now. Over the next month to month and a half, we'll be gathering all of the voice of customer information, and then we're working, coming back to MDIC, finalizing the scope of what this project is, and chartering it, and then moving forward with a defined team to accomplish the tasks. So that sort of outlines the concept of where we're at. Right now, we have our initial team that's involved with the activities, but as we move into the execution phase of the project, we would be interested in pulling on additional team members from industry that are interested. And you can reach out to Susanna or MDIC directly and indicate your interest if you have a desire to participate as part of that. So with that said, I'll hand it back to Suzanne and say thank you very much.
Okay, Garth, thanks very much to you as well and to all our presenters. And certainly want to reiterate Garth's last point. If you want to get involved and or hear more, send a request in to info@mdic.org. These teams are volunteer teams, so the more broad perspective and input we get from both large as well as smaller organizations, the more robust our solutions will be. And you know, part of the reason for this large forum is that we can get interest from other groups and organizations that may not have signed up for the forum originally. I have just a couple questions that came in online, and I think the first one is, I'll paraphrase it, it's a little bit maybe controversial. I don't know if it is or not, but I'm going to turn it to Steve Solomon and maybe Joe Sapiente to take a crack at answering this in terms of what do you see as new and different, because we've heard some of these terms before and in the past.
This is Steve. I'm happy to start off. I think the engagement that we're seeing in this process is very different. I think lots of people have looked at some of these issues independently. They're tough issues. But I think we reiterated many times in this initiative that we need to bring all the stakeholders together if there's going to, hopefully reach some consensus or some agreement about the path forward, that we all can sort of, whether it's measure this, looking at the measures, looking at the maturity models, looking at the analytics. I think there's a great difference in the process that we're using. Let Joe add his thoughts.
I would echo that, Steve. I think for me, from the very beginning, it's been about the level of engagement and really the commitment that's been made. And I think the other piece of this is the ability to speak openly in a safe environment and open forum, and to share, comments, concerns, criticisms as a team. And I think so that really does come from that engagement piece. And I think for me, it really has been engagement and commitment.
Great, thank you both. And Joe, I think you also received a question more on one of your definitions where it talked about provide usability was in the definition, if you wanted to just answer that technical question.
Sure, and the approach that we took when we were working on the definition, and for those of you who may not be able to see the question, it does say, what does provide usability mean in the definition, and that's in the definition of quality. And if we remember, we look back at some of the conversations and reports that have been available in 2011 and beyond around human factors and usability, we tried to incorporate ease of use, align to user requirements, and we felt that the best way to kind of capture recognizing risk analysis and the risk benefit that I mentioned was to address it through adding the word usability. We felt that was all-encompassing.
Great, thanks, Joe. Another question came in, and recently heard that FDA is planning to require manufacturers to supply metrics directly to FDA on a periodic basis. Are the metrics models you are developing going to define those future reporting requirements?
So this is Steve. Let me take a shot at that. As Kristen explained before, we're both looking at across the medical product sector at various different, we're all challenging how do we measure quality whether it's pharmaceuticals or medical devices. That specific area of focus is in the pharmaceutical area. They're using some of the authorities under the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. and they've issued some guidance in our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research that's looking at trying to reach some agreement similar to this process, but using a different process on what are the quality measures to measure pharmaceutical quality. Chris can add to it, but we've taken a different approach on the medical device area, and this is not a requirement. There is no authority. The FDASIA FDA Safety and Innovation Act doesn't apply to the medical device area.
And this is Kristen. I would only add that, I mean, we've been very clear. One of the reasons that we want to bring these measures that we're turning into metrics conversation to this broader forum is to get input. Certainly, that the hope is that the more they're discussed and validated and supported, that would inform FDA and be good information for FDA to use. But there's no direct connection at this point. FDA is going to do its own work with the same measures that we developed and go from there. So we're hoping that this will be a very robust and kind of transparent way to have the conversation that we need to have together moving forward, but without any commitments on either side.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And it looks like we're, I don't see any more questions coming in, and it looks like we're just about at the closing hour for this webinar. I wanted to thank all the panelists and presenters for their presentations this afternoon, and also thank the audience for your interest. Again, we welcome very diverse and different representation on these working groups, so please send information in to the email address at MDIC. We will be posting both the video as well as the presentation on the MDIC website, so you will see that shortly. And I know Kristen Zandalo from MDIC will also be sending out a short survey at the end of this program. And just as a little bit of advertisement for the next MDICx session, that will be held on July 23rd, and that's on the patient preference framework and CDRH guidance in this area. So with that, Joe, Steve, any final words before we close out for the session?
Just thank everyone for joining, taking the time today. I think you can hear the excitement from the folks working on this and the opportunity here, and you know, we're looking forward to having future engagements with folks to keep people abreast of the work going on. Joe?
Thanks, Stephen. I would agree. I appreciate everyone's participation. Again, thanks to Suzanne for helping pull this together, and to the presenters for pulling the content and certainly conveying a very passionate message about how committed we are to this program and how important we think that these sub-councils are going to be to the success of the case for quality. And to echo Garth's comments about volunteerism, and I appreciated everyone's willingness to participate in any one of these projects. So again, thank you very much for your participation, and we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Okay. Thank you, and a good day to all. Goodbye.